The sun had just begun to rise over London, casting a golden glow on the grand Buckingham Palace. The air was crisp, carrying the sound of birds chirping and the soft chatter of early morning tourists. People from all over the world gathered outside the palace gates, excited to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Cameras were ready, children sat on their parents' shoulders, and tour guides explained the significance of this age-old tradition. Among the guards standing tall and still as statues was Private James Carter. He had been serving in the Royal Guard for years, and he took pride in his duty. Dressed in his perfectly pressed red tunic and tall bearskin hat, he looked every bit the part of the disciplined soldier. His face remained serious, his posture strong. His job was not just about standing still, it was about representing honor, discipline, and respect for the country. The crowd watched in awe as the guards performed their movements with perfect timing. Their boots clicked against the pavement in unison, their rifles held with absolute precision. It was a display of skill, tradition, and dedication. Some tourists whispered about how difficult it must be to remain still for so long, especially in unpredictable weather. But for Carter, it was second nature. He had trained for years to perfect his role, and nothing could shake his focus. As the ceremony continued, the crowd grew larger. People pushed forward to get a better view, some even leaning against the barriers, eager to capture the perfect photo or video. Among the crowd, an older woman smiled as she watched, telling her grandson how she had seen the ceremony when she was his age. A young couple held hands, whispering about how impressive the guards looked. Excitement and admiration filled the air. But not everyone in the crowd was there to enjoy the event. A man, standing a few feet away from the front row, had a different kind of energy. His arms were crossed, his expression stiff. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if unimpressed. His large dog sat beside him, its ears perked up, sensing its owner's tension. Carter, though fully aware of everything happening around him, did not react. His training had taught him to remain still and composed, no matter what distractions arose. Over the years, he had seen people try all sorts of things to get a reaction from the guards. Funny faces, silly dances, and even loud noises. But he had also learned to ignore them all. The morning was peaceful, the ceremony going on as planned. But something about the man in the crowd felt different. He wasn't just a curious tourist or an excited spectator. There was something unsettling in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't there just to watch. And soon, the day would take a turn no one could have expected. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace was growing, with more people gathering to watch the famous changing of the guard. Tourists held up their phones, snapping pictures and recording videos. Some whispered to each other about how impressive the ceremony was, while others stood quietly, simply enjoying the moment. The sound of marching boots echoed through the air as the guards performed their routine with absolute precision. Among the crowd, a man named Rick Dunham stood with his arms crossed, his face showing no excitement or admiration. He wasn't there for the same reason as the others. While most people looked at the royal guards with respect, he had a different expression, one of annoyance. He watched the soldiers with narrowed eyes, shaking his head slightly as if he didn't believe in what they were doing. Beside him sat his large German shepherd, its ears twitching every time the guards moved. The dog was strong and well-trained, but it seemed alert, sensing the tension in its owner. Rick's fingers tapped against his thigh as he muttered something under his breath. The people around him didn't pay much attention at first, too focused on the ceremony, but a few started noticing his behavior. A young woman standing nearby glanced at him and took a small step away. She wasn't sure why, but something about his energy felt off. An older couple, enjoying their visit to London, noticed the way Rick was staring at one particular guard. It was Private James Carter, the same guard who had stood still and focused since the ceremony began. Unlike the other guards, Carter seemed to be the only one Rick was paying attention to. Rick's muttering grew louder, and a few people turned their heads toward him. His voice was low but firm, his words sharp as he spoke to himself. It wasn't clear what he was saying, but his tone wasn't friendly. His dog, sensing something in his voice, sat up straighter, watching its owner carefully. Carter, on the other hand, remained still. He was aware of everything happening around him. He had trained for moments like this. Over the years, he had learned to ignore distractions, whether it was a child trying to make him laugh or someone yelling in his direction. His job was to stand firm, no matter what. Rick's frustration seemed to grow with every passing second. He looked around, as if expecting someone else to share his feelings, but no one did. The other tourists were too busy enjoying the ceremony. Some were smiling, some were recording videos, and others were simply admiring the discipline of the guards. Then Rick's eyes flickered to his dog. He tightened his grip on the leash, his fingers curling around it. He leaned down slightly and whispered something to the animal. The dog's ears twitched again, and its body tensed. Something was about to happen, and no one in the crowd was prepared for what came next. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace remained focused on the changing of the guard ceremony. People watched in admiration as the soldiers moved in perfect formation, their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. The bright red tunics and tall black bearskin hats made them look almost larger than life, standing as symbols of discipline and honor. But while the crowd was enjoying the moment, Rick had a different plan. His fingers tightened around the leash of his German shepherd, his eyes locked onto Private James Carter. The tension in his face grew stronger as he whispered something to the dog. The animal, sensing its owner's mood, became more alert, its ears standing tall and its body stiffening. It was waiting for a command. For a moment, everything felt still. The guards continued their movements, unaware of what was about to happen. The tourists kept their eyes on the ceremony, not noticing the way Rick shifted his stance. But then, in an instant, he unclipped the leash. The dog, now free, lunged forward. A gasp spread through the crowd as the large animal sprinted toward Carter, barking loudly. People stepped back in shock, some raising their hands to their mouths. A few tourists instinctively grabbed their children, pulling them closer. The peaceful ceremony was suddenly interrupted by a rush of fear and confusion. The dog's powerful legs carried it forward quickly, and its sharp teeth flashed as it let out another loud bark. It was a terrifying sight. An attack happening right in front of Buckingham Palace, right in the middle of a sacred tradition. Some people even dropped their phones in shock, while others scrambled to record what was happening. But Carter did not move. Despite the sudden attack, despite the loud barking and the sight of a charging dog, he remained as still as ever. His face did not show fear. His posture did not change. It was as if he hadn't even noticed the danger rushing toward him. The crowd couldn't believe it. How could he stand so still when a large dog was coming straight at him? Some expected him to run, to push the animal away, or to call for help. But he did none of those things. He stayed in his position, his grip on his rifle firm, his expression calm. As the dog got closer, something unexpected happened. Instead of slowing down, instead of hesitating, it suddenly changed its behavior. The powerful barks softened, its aggressive posture wavered. Just a few feet away from Carter, the dog's steps became less forceful, as if it was confused. The crowd noticed the change immediately. The same dog that had been charging forward with such power just moments ago was now showing signs of hesitation. Something was happening, something no one could have predicted. And in that moment, everyone realized this was no ordinary royal guard. The large German shepherd had been charging toward Private James Carter with full force, its loud barks echoing across the palace grounds. The crowd had frozen in shock, their eyes wide with fear. Some had backed away, expecting the worst. Others had their phones raised, recording what they thought would be a dangerous moment. But as the dog got closer, something strange happened. The animal's steps slowed. Its barks, once aggressive and loud, became quieter. Its posture, which had been tense and ready to attack, suddenly changed. It was as if the dog was second-guessing itself. The energy around Carter was different, calm, controlled, unwavering. Carter had not moved an inch. He had not flinched, had not stepped back, had not even looked afraid. He simply stood his ground, his body still as a statue, his eyes focused straight ahead. His grip on his rifle was firm, but he did not raise it in defense. Instead, he let the dog come closer. The crowd was confused. Just moments ago, this animal had looked ready to attack. Now, it seemed unsure. It had slowed to a walk, sniffing the air as it approached Carter. Its ears twitched and its tail, which had been stiff with aggression, started to lower slightly. Rick, standing behind the crowd, looked frustrated. This was not what he had expected. He had thought the dog would scare Carter, make him react, make him break his disciplined stance. But now his own dog was hesitating. He clenched his fists, muttering under his breath, trying to process what was happening. Then something even more unbelievable took place. Carter finally moved, but only slightly. With slow and precise control, he shifted his grip on his rifle and, in one firm motion, extended his hand slightly downward, palm facing the dog. It was not a fearful movement. It was a command, a silent one. The dog stopped completely. The crowd held their breath. The tourists who had expected chaos were now watching something extraordinary unfold. The large German shepherd, which had been unleashed to attack, was now standing still, looking up at Carter with uncertainty. The powerful energy that had made it charge forward had been met with something even stronger, a presence of true discipline and control. Carter's calm energy was unshaken, and the dog could sense it. Animals, especially dogs, could read human emotions, and this royal guard was not afraid. He was not aggressive. He was simply in control. Then, in a low and firm voice, Carter spoke a single word. "Sit." The dog, without hesitation, obeyed. Gasps spread through the crowd. People exchanged looks of disbelief. A few even whispered in amazement. Had they really just seen that? The very dog that had been running to attack had now sat down, right in front of the guard, its head tilted slightly, as if waiting for further instructions. Rick's face turned red with frustration. This was not how things were supposed to go. But for Carter, this was just another day on duty. He had not broken his discipline. He had not lost his composure. And most importantly, he had just turned an attack into obedience, with nothing but his presence and control. The crowd had come to see a ceremony. But what they had just witnessed was far more remarkable. The entire crowd stood frozen, their eyes locked on the unbelievable scene unfolding before them. The large German shepherd, which had been sent to attack, was now calmly sitting in front of Private James Carter. The very same dog that had been barking and charging just moments ago was now looking up at the royal guard with obedience, as if waiting for his next command. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people whispered in amazement, while others exchanged looks of disbelief. A few had even stopped recording, too stunned to react. How had this happened? How had the royal guard, without moving much at all, stopped a full-speed attack with nothing but his presence? Rick, the dog's owner, stood several feet away, his face tight with frustration. This was not the outcome he had wanted. He had expected Carter to panic, to react, to break his disciplined stance. He had thought the dog would scare him, make him step back, or even raise his rifle in defense. But instead, Carter had done something no one had expected. He had stayed calm. He had shown no fear. And now his very presence had controlled the situation in a way Rick could not understand. Carter, still standing tall, did not acknowledge Rick's anger. His eyes remained focused straight ahead, his posture unshaken. But those watching closely could see it. He was in complete control. His training had prepared him for situations where discipline was the strongest weapon. And at that moment, it was clear that his discipline had overpowered aggression. The dog, still sitting, let out a small whine and lowered its head slightly, as if confused. It had been expecting orders from its owner, but now it had responded to someone else. Carter had not raised his voice, had not shown force, yet the dog had obeyed him. A little girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, how did he do that?" she asked in a hushed voice. Her mother shook her head in amazement. "I don't know, sweetheart, but that was incredible." Rick clenched his jaw. His plan had failed, and the people around him were no longer ignoring him. Some had turned to look at him, their expressions filled with disapproval. A few even shook their heads, disgusted by what he had done. A voice called out from the crowd, "That's real discipline right there." Another person added, "That's why they're the best." Rick's frustration grew. He had wanted to humiliate Carter, to break him, but instead, he had only made the royal guard look even more impressive. His own dog had chosen obedience over aggression, and now Rick was left standing there, embarrassed in front of everyone. Carter, as always, remained still. He had not reacted to Rick's actions, nor had he let the attack shake him. The discipline of a true soldier had won the moment. But this was not over yet. Something told the crowd that Rick was not ready to walk away just yet. The crowd remained silent, their eyes shifting between Private James Carter and Rick. The atmosphere was tense, thick with the weight of what had just happened. A large German shepherd, once charging in attack, now sat calmly at Carter's feet, looking up at him with obedience. It was a sight no one had expected. Rick, still standing a few feet away, was visibly upset. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists. He had sent his dog forward with full confidence that it would shake the royal guard, make him react, embarrass him in front of everyone. But instead, Carter had remained still, completely unfazed. His discipline had not only stopped the attack, but had also gained the obedience of the very dog meant to challenge him. People in the crowd whispered among themselves. Some were shaking their heads, clearly disapproving of Rick's actions. Others were still processing what they had just witnessed. A few tourists quietly took steps away from Rick, sensing the anger radiating from him. Rick refused to accept defeat. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Get up," he commanded, his voice sharp as he addressed his dog. The German shepherd's ears twitched, but it didn't move. It remained seated, looking up at Carter as if waiting for his permission instead. Rick gritted his teeth. "I said, get up." The dog let out a soft whine but still did not move. It had already recognized something that Rick had failed to see. Carter's presence was stronger. His energy, his discipline, his calm control over the situation had won over the animal's instincts. The crowd watched with curiosity. Would the dog listen to its owner, or had something changed? Had it truly accepted Carter's authority? Rick's frustration boiled over. He took another step forward, raising his voice. "You listen to me, not him," he snapped. Carter, still standing tall, finally spoke again. His voice was calm, steady, full of quiet authority. "The dog understands discipline," he said simply. Rick narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave the dog another silent command, a slight movement of his hand. The German shepherd, without hesitation, stood up and walked back toward Rick, but it did not look at him with the same loyalty as before. It was as if something had shifted, something Rick could not control. The crowd murmured again. Some even smiled, impressed by Carter's composure. One man in the audience chuckled. "Looks like your own dog respects him more than you." Rick's face darkened. His plan had backfired in the worst way possible. Not only had he failed to break the royal guard, but now he was the one looking foolish. His own dog had listened to a man who hadn't even raised his voice. Carter remained still, returning to his silent post. He had no interest in humiliating Rick. His actions spoke louder than words. The lesson had already been taught. But the question remained, would Rick accept it, or would his anger drive him to do something even more reckless? Rick stood there, his face tight with frustration. His own dog had just obeyed a royal guard more than him. The crowd had seen everything, and now whispers spread like wildfire. Some people shook their heads, while others exchanged amused glances. A few even chuckled quietly, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Rick's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had wanted to humiliate Carter, to make him break his discipline, to prove that the guards were just men in fancy uniforms. Instead, he had made himself look weak. His own dog had chosen to listen to a man who hadn't even raised his voice. The German shepherd, now standing by Rick's side, looked up at him but didn't seem eager to follow any further orders. It was calm, no longer aggressive, as if it had found a new leader to respect. Rick could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. His frustration only grew. He had to do something, anything, to take back control of the situation. He wasn't going to walk away like this, not after everything that had happened. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward once more, his voice sharper than before. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he said, his tone filled with anger. Carter, still standing tall, did not respond. His face remained expressionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Rick let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, I get it," he continued. "You think standing there like a statue makes you some kind of hero." Still, no response. Carter remained as still as ever. The tension in the air was thick. The crowd was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Some tourists had already stepped back, sensing Rick's growing anger. Others had their phones raised, ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. Rick's frustration finally exploded. "Say something," he shouted. "Are you even human, or are you just a puppet?" For the first time, Carter moved, but it wasn't in the way Rick expected. With slow, deliberate precision, Carter turned his head just slightly, just enough to lock eyes with Rick. His face remained calm, his posture unshaken. And then, in a voice that was quiet yet full of authority, he spoke. "A soldier does not answer to provocation." The words were simple, but they hit Rick like a hammer. The crowd let out a collective murmur of admiration. Some people even clapped. It was clear to everyone that Carter was not just ignoring Rick. He was proving a point. Rick's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had expected to see fear, anger, or frustration in Carter's eyes. Instead, he saw nothing but unwavering discipline. It was as if his insults, his actions, everything he had done, meant absolutely nothing. And in that moment, Rick realized he had already lost. Rick stood there, his chest rising and falling with frustration. His face was red, his hands shaking slightly. He had tried everything: anger, insults, even using his dog, but nothing had worked. Private James Carter remained as steady as a mountain, untouched by anything Rick had done. The crowd, once silent in shock, had now fully turned against Rick. People whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disapproval. A few murmured words like disrespectful and shameful. Some even laughed softly, not at Carter, but at how completely Rick's plan had failed. Rick's dog, the same one he had sent to attack, now stood calmly beside him. Its ears twitched, but it did not look aggressive anymore. It had recognized something its owner had failed to see. Carter was not just a man standing still. He was a symbol of discipline, control, and quiet strength. Rick took a deep breath, trying to think of what to do next. Should he say something? Should he walk away? His pride refused to let him leave without having the last word. But before he could speak, he heard footsteps approaching. A palace security officer had stepped forward. He was tall and serious-looking, dressed in a dark uniform. His sharp eyes moved between Rick and the royal guard, and then he spoke in a firm voice. "Sir, you need to leave." Rick's jaw tightened. "What? I didn't do anything." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You unleashed your dog in an attempt to provoke an officer on duty," he said. "That is not acceptable behavior." Some people in the crowd nodded in agreement. One tourist muttered, "He's lucky they're handling this peacefully." Rick looked around, realizing he had no support. No one was on his side. No one thought what he had done was clever or funny. He had only made a fool of himself. His own dog had listened to a stranger more than him. Rick let out a sharp breath and yanked the leash. "Come on," he grumbled to his dog. The German Shepherd followed him, but not with its usual energy. It was almost as if the animal itself was embarrassed. As Rick turned to walk away, one final moment made everything clear. Carter, still standing tall, had already returned to his original position. It was as if nothing had happened. No anger, no pride, no reaction. Just pure discipline. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but many people kept glancing back at Carter in admiration. They had not just witnessed a man in uniform standing still, they had seen the power of true composure. A little boy tugged on his father's sleeve and pointed at Carter. "Dad, I want to be like him when I grow up," he said, eyes full of wonder. His father smiled. "Me too, son, me too." And just like that, the world moved on. But for those who had been there that day, the lesson of discipline, control, and true strength would not be forgotten.